President Trump, who's just announced tariffs for Canada imports. The president saying moments ago on Truth Social that there will be a 35% tariff on goods imported from Canada starting.
Backyard chicken farming has seen a spike in popularity over the past few months.
Supermarket shelves lined with Brazilian and Turkish eggs, each carton pushing close to $5 a dozen, while here in America, farmers are literally drowning in surplus. Nearly 172 million dozen U.S. eggs rejected on the export market. A staggering 38% collapse in trade with Canada, Japan, and Mexico. Piles of perfectly good eggs sit in storage, some even dumped as Washington's tariff games backfire in spectacular fashion. This isn't just about breakfast anymore. It's about broken promises, shattered trust, and the slow erosion of America's agricultural backbone. The very system that was supposed to protect farmers is now suffocating them under the weight of its own contradictions. And if you think this stops at eggs, you're in for a rude awakening. Because what's unraveling here is much bigger than a carton in your fridge. Stick with me. Hit like, subscribe, and keep watching, because the full story will stun you. The crisis begins with a single brutal number. 172 million dozen U.S. eggs rejected on the export market in 2025. That's not a typo. It's nearly 2 billion individual eggs once destined for Canada, Japan, and Mexico, now stuck in cold storage or left to spoil. Why? Because Trump's tariffs, designed to protect American farmers, triggered retaliation abroad. Instead of paying higher prices, America's closest trade partners shifted overnight to Brazil and the European Union. What should have been a safeguard turned into a chokehold, slamming the very industry it claimed to defend. Let's put this collapse into perspective. The U.S. egg export market shrank by a staggering 38% in 1 year, wiping out almost half of the cross-border demand. Canada, long the #1 buyer of U.S. eggs, cut purchases by over 60%. Japan and Mexico followed suit, diversifying their supply chains toward Europe, Turkey, and Brazil. Suddenly, Iowa farmers who once counted on trucks crossing into Ontario or shipments headed to Tokyo were left staring at warehouses filled with unsold cartons. For an industry that depends on razor-thin margins, this was catastrophic. And here's the kicker. While U.S. producers drown in surplus, Canadian grocery chains proudly showcase Brazilian imports stamped with flashy farm-fresh logos. American consumers, meanwhile, walk past those same eggs, sometimes in the very same aisle, but priced at nearly $5 per dozen. That's the paradox. Abundance at home, sky-high prices in stores, and profits slipping away to foreign competitors. The fallout didn't take long to hit farms directly. Reports show that by the second quarter of 2025, at least 64 U.S. egg farms shut their doors. Most of them were family-run operations in states like Iowa, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, the very heart of America's agricultural engine. Farmers who spent decades building their businesses suddenly faced the impossible choice: scale back, store mountains of product with no buyers, or walk away altogether. One Iowa farmer, quoted in local press, described it bluntly: "We're paying to produce food nobody wants, while stores sell foreign eggs at record prices. It makes no sense." This disconnect reveals something deeper than just a tariff miscalculation. It exposes the fragility of America's food supply chain. For decades, farmers believed exports were their lifeline. Steady demand from neighbors like Canada guaranteed stability. But in one swift policy move, that trust shattered. Instead of strengthening America's bargaining power, tariffs turned into a boomerang, knocking U.S. producers out of the very markets they dominated. And let's not forget the other crisis compounding the pain: avian flu. Over 38 million hens culled in 2025 alone drove production costs even higher. Farmers already facing lower demand had to spend more just to keep operations afloat. That meant feed prices climbing, veterinary care rising, and biosecurity measures draining budgets. In theory, fewer hens should have balanced the oversupply. But with exports collapsing, even reduced flocks couldn't solve the mountain of eggs piling up. This is where the human side of the story becomes unavoidable. Entire towns built around agriculture feel the sting. Trucking companies that hauled daily loads to border crossings cut back routes. Feed suppliers who depended on farm contracts reported sharp downturns. Small rural economies, already fragile, were shaken as the egg trade buckled. And through it all, consumers scratched their heads at grocery stores. Why were eggs suddenly as expensive as steak when farmers couldn't give them away? People stopped trusting the logic of the system, and once that trust erodes, it's nearly impossible to win it back. But the story doesn't stop at confusion. It escalates, because behind every carton dumped, every farm closure, and every confused shopper is a larger, more ominous trend. the erosion of America's credibility as a reliable agricultural leader. If allies like Canada and Japan no longer trust U.S. supply stability, what's next for wheat, soybeans, or beef? Eggs may just be the opening act in a wider unraveling, and that's where things start to get even darker. Because while the public wrestles with $5 eggs and shuttered farms, the ripple effects on future investment decisions are already taking hold. Farmers are canceling expansion projects, bankers are tightening lending terms, and even major retailers are hedging by signing contracts with foreign suppliers. In other words, the egg crisis isn't a glitch, it's a warning sign. So, what happens when surpluses turn into dumping, when farms collapse by the dozen, and when even Walmart shelves turn foreign? The answer isn't pretty, and in part 2, we'll break down just how deep this spiral goes. By the time the export collapse made headlines, the damage was already spreading across the entire food chain. Surpluses turned into a nightmare. By mid-2025, the U.S. was sitting on more than 60 million surplus eggs, stored in massive cold facilities or worse, dumped outright when storage hit capacity. 4 states reported surpluses more than 2.5 times normal levels. Farmers were literally paying to dispose of food. In a nation where families already struggle with grocery bills, the image of truckloads of eggs going to waste struck a nerve. And yet, grocery prices kept climbing. By July, consumers were paying anywhere between $3.80 and $5.20 a dozen, the third highest price in 15 years. How can eggs be wasted in one corner of the country and sold at luxury prices in another? That's the paradox of a supply chain twisted by policy missteps. The tariffs meant to secure stability ended up distorting the entire system. Eggs that once flowed naturally to foreign markets were now bottled up, creating artificial scarcity at home. The abundance never reached consumers, it just rotted in warehouses. This disconnect is where public trust began to fracture. Families saw headlines about surpluses but faced higher prices at checkout. They didn't care about macroeconomic charts or international trade flows. They just saw what felt like manipulation, food wasted while their budgets were drained. The narrative became simple. Washington doesn't understand, and farmers are paying the price. The consequences for producers grew sharper. Farmers who had planned expansions shelved them. 17% canceled projects outright, citing uncertainty and global demand. Bankers tightened loans, nervous about volatility. Insurance premiums crept higher. Even major retailers like Walmart and Kroger began hedging, stocking imported eggs from Brazil and Turkey to avoid empty shelves. That sent another signal. Even corporate America doubted the resilience of U.S. supply. For smaller farms, the blow was personal. Imagine running a family operation in Indiana, producing steady volumes for decades, only to find your eggs rejected abroad and undercut at home by imports. You watch your community shrink as trucking companies reduce routes, feed suppliers slash orders, and local hardware stores lose farm customers. It isn't just eggs disappearing, it's the economic lifeline of rural America evaporating, and all of this unfolds under the shadow of avian flu. The culling of 38 million hens wasn't just a statistic, it was a crushing expense. Each culled bird represented lost feed costs, lost labor, and lost potential revenue. Instead of stabilizing markets, the flu intensified them. Less production should have meant higher farm gate prices, but with exports evaporating, the supply-demand balance broke entirely. The result? Farmers trapped in a vice. Higher costs, lower demand, and no relief in sight. Meanwhile, America's competitors wasted no time filling the void. Brazil rapidly scaled up exports to Canada and Japan, advertising stable, reliable supply with slick campaigns. The European Union jumped in too, touting its biosecurity standards as superior to the U.S. Within months, markets once dominated by Iowa and Pennsylvania were being carved up by São Paulo and Madrid. For foreign suppliers, this wasn't just opportunism, it was strategy. They saw an opening and seized it, eroding America's dominance in yet another agricultural commodity. The bigger question is credibility. Once Canada diversifies away from U.S. eggs, what incentive do they have to ever return? Once Japanese buyers secure contracts with Brazil, why would they risk dependency on an American system so easily destabilized by tariffs and disease outbreaks? That's the long-term cost. Trust, once broken, rarely repairs itself, and this credibility crisis bleeds into other sectors. If eggs are vulnerable, why not soybeans? Why not beef? Why not the very crops that form the backbone of U.S. agricultural exports? International partners now see America as unpredictable, its supply chains too entangled with politics, its policies too reactionary, and its farmers too exposed to risk. The egg crisis isn't isolated. It's a preview of a broader unraveling. For consumers, the absurdity only deepens. A Purdue study revealed that 53% of Americans called the situation absurd. Shelves full of foreign eggs, US farms collapsing, prices soaring, and Washington shrugging. It reads like satire, but it's reality. Tariffs meant to protect farmers instead exposed their fragility, while foreign suppliers walked away with the markets America built. And here's the real danger. If this can happen with eggs, it can happen with wheat, soybeans, beef, any sector that underpins not only the economy, but America's credibility abroad. The lesson is clear. Protectionism without strategy becomes self-sabotage. And unless leaders learn from this disaster, we may be watching the beginning of a much larger decline. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Trust me, the story doesn't end here.